Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Clinical Evaluation, Demonstration of Clinical Safety and Performance. My name is Sarah Steck, and I'm the Legal and Regulatory Director here at GMED North America. This presentation was prepared by Anne LaRusso, who's one of our certification project managers and a senior lead auditor, and I'm presenting it on her behalf. As many of you know already, our organization provides certification and customized training services in the medical sector for markets worldwide, including Europe, Asia, Canada, Brazil, and Australia. If you have any technical issues, please let us know by using our chat console, and we'll try and solve everything in the process. Please note that today's session is pre-recorded, so if you have any colleagues who are unable to attend, or if you yourself are not able to stay for the whole time, we'll provide you with a link to the presentation as well as a PowerPoint presentation later on this afternoon. During the recording, I'll be here, as well as for about 10 minutes after the presentation, to answer your questions. If you'd like to submit questions, please do so in either the chat box or the Q&A box that you see on your screen. Now, because we have an important crowd today, we'll go ahead and apologize in advance if we're unable to answer all of your questions. But we will keep track of them and provide answers to everybody within the next couple weeks. If you have any specific questions you'd like to discuss after the webinar, you can either email us or give us a call using the address and the phone number provided at the end of the presentation on the last slide. Now, as you certainly know, the European Medical Devices Directives focus on the safety and performance of the devices that are put on the market. As part of other evidence or means that can be used, the clinical evidence, or also called clinical data, is a key point to show evidence that devices are in compliance with the essential requirements. This was called out already in the initial directives and was even emphasized by the last revision of the directive back in 2007. When we look at the draft that revises the medical devices directives with the upcoming European regulation, the same focus persists on the clinical data with even more stringent requirements toward the manufacturers in the demonstration and the notified bodies in the assessment and required competencies. But they are always in the same direction: improve the reliability of the safety and performance of the medical devices that are put on the market. So let's talk about the objectives of this webinar. Now, this presentation is not meant to provide you with a training on clinical evaluations, but the goal today is to talk about the current situation regarding the demonstration of safety and performance throughout the clinical evaluation. So what is currently required and what are the best practices? We will share our experience on this topic, including some common errors to avoid. And finally, we'll give you a quick overview on the upcoming regulatory changes that impact the clinical evaluation, knowing that the new regulation is still under discussion and can be subject to modifications by the European Commission. And with that, let's get started with the first section entitled Context and Requirements. In order to understand the context and regulatory environment with regards to the clinical evaluation, we need to be sure that we know the vocabulary that we use when we're talking about clinical evaluation, safety, performance, clinical investigation, etc. So let's quickly get some definitions for those words commonly used by regulations, guidance, and different actors, including manufacturers and notified bodies, for example, tech file reviewers or auditors. The definitions are provided mainly by one key document that's publicly available: the MEDEV Guidance Reference 2.7.1, and the Medical Devices Directive, which also gives the definition of clinical data. So let's have a look to those definitions. So first, the definition for clinical evaluation is the assessment and analysis of clinical data pertaining to a medical device to verify the clinical safety and performance of the device when used as intended by the manufacturer. Clinical safety is the absence of unacceptable clinical risks when using the device according to the manufacturer's instructions for use. Clinical performance is the ability of a medical device to achieve its intended purpose as claimed by the manufacturer. So clinical data. Some sources of clinical data may include, for example, the results of pre- and post-market clinical investigations of the device, results of pre- and post-market clinical investigations or other studies reported in the scientific literature of a justifiably comparable device, and published and or unpublished reports on other clinical experience of either the device in question or a justifiably comparable device. So a clinical investigation is any systematic investigation or study in or on one or more human subjects undertaken to assess the safety and or performance of a medical device. So as you can see, those definitions are pretty clear and aligned with the terms used by the Medical Devices Directives and other guides that were initially published by the Global Harmonization Task Force, which has since been replaced by the IMDRF. The citation at the bottom of this slide is the GHTF document providing a glossary and definitions of the terms used in all GHTF public guidances. So now that we understand and are more familiar with the terms, let's continue with the requirements. What are the manufacturers required to show in order to demonstrate the device safety and performance as expected when it's used in humans or in real life? Is it required for all devices or limited to some classes? Is it only expected for implants? Can I even avoid a clinical evaluation? When would I need to be required to present clinical studies on my own product? Now, these kinds of questions are pretty common, and we get them a lot. Basically, you can find the regulatory requirements in two main directives that are applicable to medical devices. The main European directives governing medical devices and active implantable medical devices, as listed in the indent on the first indent of this slide, And in addition, Directive 2001-20 CE, which is certainly less familiar to manufacturers, but it's still applicable in the context of clinical investigations when clinical trials are conducted. Another point, this directive is applicable for any clinical trials conducted on devices already CE marked or not yet CE marked. Now, as noted on the bottom of this slide, for convenience reasons, all of the annex numbers used in the following slides refer to the MDD, which is 9342 EEC, as modified by the 2007-47 directive, and that represents the most current applicable version. Now, here are the requirements coming from the current MDD. You can find them in Annex 1, which is the essential requirements that represent the mainstay of the directive. And you can find them in Annex 10, which is the appendix of the directive that is specifically dedicated to clinical evaluation. Basically, Essential Requirement 6.A gives the inputs, and Annex 10 further delineates the objectives and obligations and potential routes utilized for the demonstration. But what is the purpose of the clinical evaluation? Well, as I previously said, it is one of the key elements to be addressed as part of the demonstration to the essential requirements. Another important point, as other essential requirements, the clinical evaluation is applicable to any of the medical devices, and whatever their classification or the assessment route that's selected by the manufacturer, whether or not a design dossier is included. So you can see on this slide that Annex 10 of the MDD is always called out in all routes that can be chosen for CE marking. So let's take a little bit closer look at the requirements as detailed in Annex 10. The clinical evaluation must be conducted methodically and following a predefined procedure or protocol. It's important to show that the process is consistent and organized. Also, harmonized standards can be used based on the manufacturer's decision. There are three possible ways to evaluate the clinical data. First, a critical evaluation of the relevant scientific literature which is available and current, so aligned with the state of the art, and relates to the safety, performance, and design characteristics and intended purpose of the device. Of course, a prerequisite to choose this route is that the equivalence of the device to the products that have supporting clinical data is fully demonstrated in detail and the data used can demonstrate compliance with the relevant requirements. Very important to note that only common indications and general concepts are not sufficient to support the equivalence between the devices. A second possibility is a critical evaluation of results of all clinical investigations or clinical studies or trials conducted on the device itself. Of course, this is the best way to show how the device performs under the normal conditions of use and to evaluate the potential side effects and risk. And finally, there is a possibility to combine both approaches as described here. In all cases, the data has to be documented methodically and substantiated by a critical evaluation. When I mentioned that the manufacturer has the choice between the 3 different routes for a clinical evaluation, it is true. But there is a nuance for Class 3 devices and for implantable devices. As you can see, Section 1.1a of Annex 10 of the MDD has a specific additional requirement that stipulates that the first choice for those devices is the clinical investigations that must be provided, unless it is duly justified. So, it's clear that when a notified body examines a Class 3 device or an implant, it is expected to have clinical data available for the device itself. If not, the manufacturer has to be challenged in the justification, which will be a robust demonstration of the equivalence with the reference devices and with clinical data that are relevant with all the information claimed by the manufacturer. Now that can be indications, patient population treated, contraindications, conditions of utilization, and so forth. So that's all the information claimed by the manufacturer. Another requirement is that the clinical evaluation report should be linked to the technical documentation. So it's basically embedded into the tech file or referenced in the tech file. So we are not yet done with the requirements, so hang in there. Another important point is that the clinical evaluation has not only to be documented at the beginning, when the manufacturer originally CE marks the device, but it needs to be kept up to date using the post-market surveillance data. It's actually understandable that clinical data are subject to change based on potential new information, such as identification of new side effects, identification of potential new indications based on physician practices, or identification of new potential patient populations. In all cases, the manufacturer has to keep in mind that all the post-market surveillance information has to proactively feed the clinical evaluation documentation. Now, the last point of the requirements coming from the MDD. As explained previously, clinical data are used to demonstrate compliance with the essential requirements. As understood, it's applicable for any type of device, whatever their classification. Now, there can be exceptions where the clinical evaluation is not appropriate. For example, when the medical device has no clinical performance. Section 1.1d of Annex 10 requires duly justification when clinical data, whatever the route, cannot be used for the demonstration of compliance with the essential requirements, and when that demonstration can only be supported by preclinical data. For example, bench testing or simulation use. So let's very briefly talk about requirements other than the ones in the Medical Devices Directive. When placing a product on the market, any additional local regulations have to be considered in addition to the directive, and it's the manufacturer's responsibility to identify and comply with all of the additional specifications. Now, harmonized standards can also provide a framework for the establishment of the clinical evaluation. EN ISO 1345 on the quality management systems relating to medical devices and the risk management standard EN ISO 14971 trigger the clinical evaluation as well. Of course, it's also relevant to consider the harmonized standard EN ISO 14155, specifically focused on the good clinical practices to follow when a clinical investigation is considered. And finally, product-related harmonized standards remind the need for clinical evaluation as part of the design evaluation and validation of safety and performance. The recommendations of those harmonized standards are aligned with the original directive. As previously mentioned, additional guidelines that are legally not binding but are recognized by the different actors involved in the CE marking process. For example, competent authorities, commission services, industries, notified bodies, and other interested parties. These guides are valuable, and they promote a common approach by manufacturers and notified bodies, helping everyone to be on the same page when implementing the regulatory requirements. This is the case for all the MedDev guidelines, Series 2.7 on clinical evaluation and clinical investigation. And on this slide, you'll see that list of MedDevs. Several guidelines established by the former organization GHTF were initially taken as reference for the development of the MedDev guidelines. So these are important documents as well. And so just to finish with a long list of references that give the framework in terms of the obligations, objectives, specifications, and methodologies, the last supporting guidance documents available to all actors are the documents from the Notified Bodies Operations Group, most commonly known NBOG, that promulgate examples of best practices to be adopted by both notified bodies and those organizations responsible for their designation and control. Now that we went through the requirements, let's take a look at the methodology. Due to the limited time we have, we can't go into the details, but we will try our best to give you as much as possible on the inputs and the tips for establishing the clinical evaluation. So let's start with some generalities. Now, just as a quick reminder, the purpose of the clinical evaluation is to verify the clinical safety and performance of the device when it's used as intended, to confirm all claims as specified in the instructions for use, and to gather data supporting the risk management process in terms of identification of risks, estimating the potential occurrence, and evaluating the severity. The clinical evaluation has to confirm the objectives and the scope. Those objectives have to be related to the specific device, performance to be achieved, or clinical claims that have to be clearly presented, and they can be qualitative or quantitative. The objectives should be defined in unambiguous terms when we talk about performances in order to be able to confirm that those performances are actually demonstrated. For example, an average reduction of pain within a certain number of months, average range of mobility expected after 6 months for an implant, etc. Also, the essential requirements that need to be addressed from a clinical perspective have to be identified, posing special performance or safety concerns, as well as any particular design features or target treatment populations that require specific attention. The scope of the clinical evaluation needs also to be informed by and cross-referenced to the manufacturer's risk management documents. Indeed, while the risk management process is expected to identify the risks associated with the device and how such risks can be addressed, the clinical evaluation is used as a complement to address the significance of any risks that remain after the design risk mitigation strategies have been employed by the manufacturer. This is the tool to assess the risk-benefit balance. Considerations also should be taken to assess whether data from the equivalent devices can be used to support the safety and/or performance of the device in question. In this case, the literature analysis route can be considered, as proposed by Annex 10 of the MDD. We need to keep in mind that the justification of equivalence between the devices has to be robust in terms of comparability and equivalence to be able to use this route, and a methodical approach needs to be presented for the critical evaluation of the clinical literature. Now, in terms of equivalency, all characteristics, technical or biological, have to be assessed and compared in addition to the condition that the devices are used for the same intended use. These characteristics should be similar to such an extent that, if there are any differences, they would not have significant impact on the performance and safety of the device. MEDEV Guidance 2.12.2 gives the list of device characteristics to be assessed for the comparison of the devices. Clinical equivalence, which is the same site on the body, used in similar population or for the same condition or purpose. Technical equivalence, which is a similar design, similar materials, and similar principle of operation. And biological equivalence, which are same materials in contact with the same human tissues or body fluids. In terms of methodology, a protocol is expected to be written for identification, selection, collation, and review of relevant literature review. The protocol will identify the data sources and types of data sources, extent of searches of databases, rationale for selection and relevance of data, and how individual data are examined in terms of relevance, where conclusions are reached about the performance, safety, and the presentational aspects of the device. At the end of the clinical evaluation, a report is compiled to form the clinical evidence of the device. Now, in this slide, we guide you through the main steps of the literature search and the literature analysis. Now, as previously said, a detailed literature search protocol is expected, and that will allow the search strategy to be reproduced if needed. The identification of the relevant studies has to be planned in the methodology. It's important to show the quality of the publication selected. Do they have a high scientific level, for example? The link between the data and the actual characteristics of the device, and again, the equivalence between the devices. An example of the classification of the data, relevance, are available in the MEDEV guidance documents, based on the level of scientific evidence of the publication, from comparative randomized study to a simple series of case studies. Once the literature search is executed, a report is then compiled to present the results of the search and its critical assessment. It's important to note that, as far as a design verification test, any deviations to the protocol should be documented in the report in regards to any impact onto the validity of the literature search outcomes. The critical analysis is another key point. It has to be reliable in terms of competence and knowledge of the person who does this assessment and in terms of objectivity, to make sure that both favorable and unfavorable data are discussed. The analysis has to develop the associated risks and hazards, as well as confirm the degree of equivalence of characteristics and evaluate the potential impact of the differences onto the performance and/or risks. Now, the conclusion has to demonstrate fulfillment of the objectives to the initial protocol, justify claimed performance, and include statements relating to the absence of additional pre-market clinical data. If relevant, it should identify missing information relating to safety and/or performance. Now, if the conclusion cannot allow the manufacturer to declare the conformity with the essential requirements, then it will need to generate supplemental data, such as conducting a clinical investigation, broaden the scope of the literature search, etc., in order to address the deficiency. As for the risk management process, the clinical evaluation is considered to be an iterative process. Now, it's important to keep in mind that high-risk devices, that is to say those based on technologies where there's little to no experience, and those that extend the intended purpose of an existing technology, for example, a new clinical use, are most likely to require clinical investigation data and not a clinical literature analysis only. A manufacturer can decide that a clinical investigation is necessary, or it is the best way for clinical evaluation. So let's have a look at this option. In which case does a manufacturer need to conduct a clinical investigation of the device? Now, as mentioned, for a Class 3 or an implantable device, unless it's duly justified. When it's a new indication not covered for a known device, when a brand new device is considered, whose components, characteristics, and/or action mode have not yet been clinically validated, when an existing device is modified and the modification significantly affects the assessment of the clinical safety and performance, when a device incorporates unknown material in contact with the body, or existing materials that are used in locations not previously exposed to this material, and for which there is no relevant clinical experience, or the device is used for a significantly longer duration. The methodology for conducting clinical investigations is governed by Annex 10.2 of the directive, which fixes the objectives: verification of the performance of the device under normal conditions of use, identification of any undesirable side effects, and the assessment of the risk-benefit ratio. In terms of ethical considerations, the clinical investigations must be carried out in accordance with the Helsinki Declaration for the protection of human subjects. This includes every step in the clinical investigation, from the first consideration of the need and justification of the study to the publication of the results. Clinical investigations must be conducted based on a pre-established plan or protocol that has to reflect the state of the art. It has to be defined in such a way as to confirm or refute the manufacturer's claims for the device. Clinical investigations must be performed in circumstances similar to the normal conditions of use of the device. Importance of the qualification and the people involved and their accessibility to the technical and clinical data regarding the device is underlined too in the directive. As for the literature route, a compiled report is expected, including a critical evaluation of all the data collected during the clinical investigation. In addition to the MDD, the harmonized standard, although it's not mandatory, is a valuable and recognized reference that gives the presumption of conformity to Annex 10 concerning the development, the implementation, and the monitoring of clinical investigations. On this slide, the main steps are described for conducting a clinical investigation, which is also called the clinical trial or study. It includes the development of a protocol delineating objectives and purpose of the study and including the ethical considerations. The evidence of the scientific level of the study has to be shown in the study plan and in the means, criteria, and tools that will be used for the monitoring. The manufacturer has to obtain formal authorization for conducting the study from the Ethics Committee and competent authorities as well. Note that the authorization regime is specified in Article 15 and Annex 8 of the MDD. Don't forget any local regulations in place with regards to clinical trials that don't replace the MDD, but have to be applied in conjunction with the directive. Any adverse events appearing during the clinical investigation have to be reported as required by the applicable regulations. And the discussions and conclusions of the report have to demonstrate the performance and safety results of the study in relation to the explicit objectives, the balance between risks and benefits, clinical relevance, and importance of the results, particularly in the light of other existing data and discussion of comparison with the state of the art. Any implications for the conduct of further studies. It should conclude on what the clinical evidence achieved. The third option proposed by the directive is a combination of literature review and clinical experience on the device. All points already discussed are then valid for this route option. Now this slide represents a summary of the clinical evaluation process. So how is the clinical evaluation activity embedded into the manufacturer's quality management system? So based on EN ISO 1345, we can see different quality system elements or processes that should integrate this activity. For example, the design process with the clinical evaluation as part of the design and development validation, The risk management process, with a tight interaction between both activities, the clinical evaluation being used as a complement to address the significance of any risks that remain after design risk mitigation strategies. And this is the tool to assess the risk-benefit ratio. Human resources, with the demonstration of qualification of the people performing this critical activity, and the monitoring and measurement processes. Remember that the manufacturer is required to actively update clinical evaluation and its documentation with data obtained from the post-market surveillance, without forgetting the obligation of reporting any adverse events. As a result, a clinical evaluation is also concerned by document control processes, with a pre-established controlled procedure and by the maintenance of the quality records. So how does the notified body assess the clinical evaluation? What are the critical points? So when you look at the MedEv guidance on clinical evaluation, the document gives some tips on the key points that the notified body will focus on. First, the clinical evaluation is an ongoing process, and it will be under the notified body's scrutiny all through the manufacturer's certification cycle, and won't take any special attention at any specific time of the initial development of a new device. As a result, the examination is done as part of a technical documentation assessment for devices subject to the EC design or type examination, or during quality system audits when design and post-market activities are covered, and during the technical file review, which is done on a sampling basis for devices not subject to the additional examination. When assessing the clinical evaluation process, the notified body pays particular attention on the following points. First, clarity of clinical performance and characteristics of the device, connection between the clinical evaluation and the risks management, identification of the essential requirements addressed by clinical evaluation. So, does the clinical evaluation provide sufficient data on safety, performance, design characteristics that are convincing for the demonstration of conformity with the relevant essential requirements? And finally, a robust demonstration of the equivalence of the device with reference devices when the literature route is selected by the manufacturer. Some additional points that the notified body focuses on are the definition of responsibilities. Are the people involved suitably qualified? The establishment of documented procedures, and for Class 3 and implantable devices, the assessment of the validity of the justification if no clinical investigation is available on those devices. The post-market clinical follow-up activity is the verification that this activity does include an active update of the clinical evaluation and its documentation. Also, verification if any justification is documented when no particular follow-up clinical study is planned on the device. This question should be raised each time the manufacturer reviews the post-market data in regards to safety and performance of its device. And finally, the notified body verifies how the conclusion confirming the positive ratio between the risk and the benefit is substantiated by the objective data. So the previous points were mainly related to the overall process and its overall acceptance. Now let's have a look more in depth at some specific critical questions. First, the clear identification of the device and its performances, including the product range, product characteristics, components, for example, are there any accessories, constituting materials, development concept, degree of novelty of the device compared to pre-existing devices, performances as claimed also in the instructions for use. Second, the purpose and objectives of the clinical evaluation. So that's demonstration of compliance with the essential requirements, and which ones, demonstration of performance and safety of the device, based on which criteria, link with the risk management and the design. Also, confirmation of relevance of the information provided to the user via labeling. Third, the presence and validity of the justification of the route chosen. Is it the literature route only, clinical investigation, or combined? What are the predicate devices? Is the similarity duly demonstrated, taking into account clinical, technical, and biological aspects? In case of differences, are there any assessments of those differences in regards to potential impact on the device performance and safety? Fourth, when the literature route is selected, focus is made on the quality and reliability of the searching protocol. So the relevance of the sources used, selection and exclusion criteria, availability of the articles, not only the summaries allowing the manufacturer to have an examination of the full data though. Now, when data are provided from the clinical experience, and that can be clinical investigations, case series, post-market safety data, which can include complaints, the focus is made on the identification of the origin of those data and their completeness and objectivity. For the clinical investigations, verification that protocol was effectively implemented in compliance with the one accepted by competent authorities and ethics committees. Also, documents related to ethics and applicable regulations required are assessed. The notified body also verified that there's a critical report of all the results collected during the investigation. This should be done by the principal investigator of the study. In addition, the notified body makes sure that the manufacturer makes any decision in regards to the safety and performance of the device based on the investigator's conclusion. When EN ISO 14155 is claimed, evidence of compliance should be shown. And finally, when the notified body assesses the conclusion, special attention is paid to the link and consistency with the risk management, the information present in the accompanying documents, the instructions for use, and the post-market activities. The notified body will have to conclude if the manufacturer's demonstration is sufficient to show that objectives are met in regards to clinical evidence, performance for each claimed indication, risk associated with the medical device, and conclusion on the risk-benefit ratio compared with the state-of-the-art. Now, let's share with you the common issues that we observed while assessing the clinical evaluations of the manufacturer's devices. Now, usually, for practical reasons, manufacturers prefer the literature route approach. Often, the justification for substantiating this choice is light, in particular when we're talking about implantable devices that are not Class 3 devices, and where no EC design or type examination is involved in the CE marking process. When the justification for the literature route is related to the fact that similar devices are already on the market, the second weakness we observe is the robustness of the equivalence. Similarities are often selected, but differences are omitted and not discussed. The extent of this type of comparison is insufficient. Another point is the availability of the literature search protocol. The manufacturer has to show a strategy of the search providing confidence in the outcomes of the search. Like for a mechanical or simulation test, the literature search must start with a pre-established protocol that will allow the confirmation of the objectivity of the report and identify any deviations. The ongoing process of the clinical evaluation is not always observable. The need to have this activity updated all along the product's life cycle is not systematic. Also, the clinical evaluation reports can lack the reference and discussion on post-market information that is already available on the product. This is the example of a device already sold on a specific market and which is now planned for the EU market. It does not mean that only the post-market information on the devices, like complaints or adverse events, could be sufficient for the clinical evaluation. But as they are available and pertinent to the device itself, they represent valued inputs to be compared with data from other sources, such as publications on equivalent products or public databases. Other difficulties that we can face are a lack of clarity in the objectives definition, and, as a consequence, a conclusion which is disconnected from the objectives. And now for the conclusion. So we've gone through the presentation of the clinical evaluation after having covered some main areas. Clinical evaluation is a regulatory requirement and a key element of the device's technical file, where objectives, specifications, and methodologies are widely covered in applicable regulations, standards, and guidelines. The clinical evaluation is a living process initiated at the development of the device and throughout its lifetime. As a consequence, it has to be updated actively using post-market surveillance data, but also considering the evolution of the state of the art, such as an update in the standards and regulations. And the clinical evaluation is not a standalone process. It has tight interconnection with other key activities supporting the demonstration of the safety and performance of the device, like design control or risk management. So before ending, let's try to anticipate the future with the upcoming changes in the regulations on medical devices that can affect the clinical evaluation activity and requirements. Now, we can't confirm 100% that these changes are currently under discussion, and they represent the definitive regulations, but they give a good understanding of the legislators' objectives, and they're always focused on providing safe, effective, but also innovative medical devices on the market. There is a plan to create a multidisciplinary medical device advisory committee that will be involved in providing directions for questions relating to medical technology affecting potentially clinical aspects. An introduction of high-risk medical devices, along with the notion of specialization of the notified bodies, with a need to have an opinion from the advisory committee for clinical evaluation relating to those high-risk category devices. Also for the high-risk devices, in the interest of increased transparency, manufacturers will have to draw up a summary of the safety and performance in a report that will be publicly available. Compared with the current directives, the regulations will be much more prescriptive in regards to the methodology for developing the clinical evaluation. And the recommendations now available in non-binding MEDEV Guidance 2.7-1 will certainly become mandatory as pointed or included in the regulations. Building on the current annex of the MDD, the new Chapter 6 on clinical evaluation and clinical investigations lays down the key obligations of manufacturers as regards to performance of the clinical evaluations needed to demonstrate the safety and performance of their devices. More detailed requirements are set out in Annex 8, which addresses the pre-market clinical evaluation and post-market clinical follow-up that together constitute a continuous process during the life cycle of a medical device. The process for conducting clinical investigations, which is currently described in basic terms in Article 15 of the MDD, is further developed. The concept of sponsor is introduced, and this sponsor can be the manufacturer, his authorized representative, or any other organization contracted, such as contract research organizations. The definition itself of the clinical evaluation might be completed with the notion of clinical benefits, in addition to device safety and performance. Now, this can imply questions relating to the efficacy of the device compared to other technologies. And also, the possibility for justifying to not provide clinical evaluations for the demonstration of compliance with the essential requirements will be further limited. All Class 3 devices will be excluded from this derogation. In addition, clinical data relevant for Class 3 devices will have to be assessed by a recognized clinical expert. The frequency of the active update on clinical evaluation will be defined by regulations, and not anymore at the manufacturer's discretion, and it's proposed to be an annual reassessment of the safety and performance for Class 3 and implantable devices. So, as you can see, the list is long and not exhaustive, since the regulators have not yet finalized the new regulations. However, it's clear that the current requirements in regards to clinical evaluation will be elevated at an upper level to improve reliability, transparency, confidence, and as a result, safety and performance of the devices that are put on the European market. Now, L&E GMED will keep you up to date on all of these changes as they come through. And that just about wraps up our webinar on the clinical evaluation. Thank you so much for staying tuned, and I hope that you found the webinar informational and instructive. Now, we have listed all of the questions you've asked throughout the webinar, and like I said, I'll be here for another 10 minutes or so to answer any other questions that you may have. But whatever I don't get to, we'll consolidate them and send out the answers in the next week or so. Now, like I said, if you can't wait that long, please don't hesitate to give us a call or send us an email. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a great day.